morning, Teun, and thank you so much for accept to make this interview for us in the Colombian Association, Micologia Association. First, tell me, where do you study? Why do you start to study fungi?
Well, as a teenager, I was very interested in nature. I did bird watching and studied plants. And at some point, I got interested in mushrooms. And then it started, and it never ended.
Okay, and which fungi would you start to study at the beginning in the university? What was first?
So as a teenager, it was mainly mushrooms. And then I started studying biology in Utrecht. I did my bachelor there already a long time ago. And then for my master's, I did a number of topics related to, surprise, surprise, mycology. So first I studied actually lichens from Colombia, stereocaulon. That was published because at that time there was a big consortium, a research consortium between the Netherlands, University of Amsterdam, University of Utrecht, the Instituto Nacional Ciencias Naturales, and other institutions at the National University in Bogota to study Andean ecosystems.
Yes.
And these stereocaulons came from the superparamo, and this was published actually. I think it was one of my first publications. Then I started doing some mushroom work on Hibeloma, which is a brown spot ectomycorrhizal fungus, very complicated taxonomically. And then I went to Colombia actually because I wanted to do some ecology, again with this Eco-Andes project. They did transect studies at that time in the Parque de los Nevados, which was a really nice time for me to be in the field for 2 months, camping and with mules. And it was very hard work, of course, because when you collect fungi, particularly mushrooms, you have to describe them after you collect them. And then you have to dry them, which in the Central Cordillera, particularly the western slope, was very humid and is still very humid. So it was very difficult to dry them. But it was a great time, I must say, really a great time. And I enjoyed the landscape a lot. And I would like to go back actually to the Parque de los Nevados.
Well, amazing to know that your first publication was from Colombia. And when I was studying the mycologists in Colombia, I read this paper and I cannot imagine you do this work with Margarita Pulido, yes?
Exactly. Margarita Pulido at that time was my counterpart. She was working at the Instituto Ciencias Naturales. She wrote also a booklet about mushrooms from Colombia. And I did in the Parque de los Nevados the higher elevations, let's say 3,000 up to the snow. And she did the lower elevations. And also she went to the Western Cordillera and the Eastern Cordillera. She did many transect studies with them. I only one.
And how was to see, to look with, because you're coming from Netherlands, and Netherlands is flat. What was your first impression when you saw this Andes Cordillera?
Oh, impressive. I mean, I was so impressed by your country, by the landscape, the nature, but also the people. And for me, it was also my very first trip away, a long, overseas trip, and then coming to Colombia. At that time, Colombia was very different from what it is now, in my view, because I noticed that in 2014, there's so many differences. At that time, you saw campesinos everywhere, with the ruanas and the hats on. That's almost gone, I think. So I think Colombia has also changed a lot, but I was so much impressed by the nature of the country.
But you say, if you remember what to say, is more diverse when you make this transect across the Cordillera de los Andes. Do you feel that it's more diverse to the highlands in the Cordillera or more in the low slopes of the Cordillera?
I was only at the higher elevations, the higher slopes, so it's difficult to make a comparison. And also this was a transect study, so it has a lot of limitations. So each plot was only visited once. So when it was raining, you had luck. If it was dry for a long time, you had bad luck, so to say. So there was a lot of limitations to that study design. But yeah, I liked it a lot. And also what I find very interesting is that when you go in the superparamo, close to the glaciers, I think the environment is getting so extreme. You find all kinds of interesting communities like basidiolichens, And I still think if you go really deep there, you also find maybe, let's say, communities between, let's say, yeast, microbial, fungi, and algae, because I think they need each other at some point. But that's just an hypothesis.
Of course. So this is a good idea for new studies about now the kind of the microbiome, the comparison between the microbiome from one side to the other side, what difference are.
Absolutely. I mean, there's so many possibilities for students in your country.
Yes.
I can only dream about it.
Yeah, we have three for a study, but you don't only work in the Cordillera. Then you make a lot a legacy for us, and this is amazing book about the macrofungi from the Caqueta, the medium Caqueta in the Amazon.
Mm-hmm.
Do you fly to the Amazon? How?
Yes, I was there only once actually.
And what do you feel?
That was just in 2014, not during my. So actually, I met Esperanza in Vancouver at the International Micological Congress in 1994. And then we spoke about Colombia, blah, blah, blah. And then later on, there was a funding possibility for biodiversity in disturbed ecosystems. And there was already at that time a lot of research going on from Tropenbos, Colombia, in the middle Caqueta area near Araraquara. So a lot of data on plants and soils were already available. And then I thought, well, why not take those data and add fungi to it? So Esperanza and I wrote this proposal and we got it. And then initially Esperanza worked on it with her students, and Carlos was one of them. And then we wrote another proposal and we got it. And again, Carlos was working on that. But I was never in Araraquara because at that time it was also not recommended to go there, because of the situation in your country that was not so stable. So it took me. So when I was in Colombia in 1980 for the first time, I said to all my friends and family, next year I'm back. Well, that took, I think, 34 years or so,
10 years ago to come back. So you returned to the Latin American Congress in Medellin. How do you feel? Do you feel that when in 2014, the mycology in Colombia advanced a lot, or or we was more organized? What did you feel? What was your first impression
I was very much impressed when I was there in 2014. I was very much impressed by the quality of the science. There was the Congress, and there was even a pre-Congress workshop at the Institute for Medical Mycology also in Medellin. So I met there Angela Restrepo and other colleagues from the Cryptococcus field, for instance. I was very much impressed by the quality of their science, I must say. And beyond that, of course, when I was there in 1980, I think Margarita Pulido was the only field mycologist. And of course, that later on changed with the work of Esperanza and all her students and colleagues. You are one of them. And of course, Aida is also one of them. And you are so active, and but also you have to realize that you are living in a country where it's an El Dorado for mycology, I would say, for biodiversity.
Thank you so much. But this is true because we are very lucky to have 3 cordilleras. We have the Amazon, we have the Pacific.
We have so much.
So we are so diverse. And that is the reason because we make this interview so the people motivate the students to study the diversity of our country. But all this first part of your professional life, you was more focused in macro fungi. But then you make this change to the micro. How was that? How was changed to the yeast world?
Yeah, it was very difficult here in Europe or in the Netherlands to get a job as a mycologist working with mushrooms. And actually I was planning my career in the direction of tropical mycology, and that was also completely impossible. So then I was working after my graduation as master student. I was working for the Dutch mushroom flora, so to say, the Flora agaricina neerlandica. But I was also knowing for myself that when there would be a vacancy, I was not the person they would select. So I also had to think about my own career in science. And of course, in the Netherlands, we had the CBS collection of microfungi, world famous collection. And then I could make a project with them and the University of Utrecht to do a bit of electron microscopy. And yeah, then I stayed there for almost 40 years, in the end. And I worked always in basidiomycetes yeasts because there was also just by luck a vacancy in that field, and they selected me as the candidate. And then, of course, there was again finally a link to mushrooms, because many mushrooms, many fungi from the Tremellomycetes, so Tremellales, Ultimaniales, actually they have mushrooms. They have mushrooms. Yeah, they form mushroom fruiting bodies, but they also have a yeast stage. So there these two worlds came together, and I think that is very interesting. And I also now collaborate with a young scientist from Belgium, Nathan Schouten, who is also very much key. And also what is interesting that before, the field of macro mushrooms and the field of yeast particularly developed completely separately, because the yeast was more following bacteriology. And I would say the other mycology fields are more working like botany, so to say.
Yes.
They were also usually in botany schools, and yeast was mainly in microbiology schools.
Yes.
And now these two fields are coming together because of DNA. So with DNA, we can make links. And I think it's very interesting. Now we can integrate also the taxonomy of yeast and, let's say, in the case of basidiomycetes yeasts, that of Tremella, for instance. And so we need both sides actually to make the full picture. And I think that is very interesting.
Yes, you tell something that is interesting because, for example, in my area, we found yeast between the entomopathogenic and fungi and the host, and this other tripartite association between the lichens, between the ascomyces and the algae. So this is very important to know, to take into account when we make field work, because sometimes
Absolutely.
when we collect the macrofungi, we don't put attention to this little tiny microscopic organism. So this
and sometimes they are also growing inside. For instance, in lichens, it turns out recently that there is many basidiomycetes yeast as a third or even a fourth component. And nobody knows exactly what they are doing, but I think it is very interesting.
So, but how do you collect these mushrooms alive to isolate the yeast? Because it's very difficult. How do you know what you have? Like when you collect, for example, when you make the cultivation of the context of the microfungi of the mushroom, how do you know there is the yeast? Because this part is.
Yeah, so first of all, I collaborate with field mycologists who know these mushrooms, where they grow. And then, we put them on the top of an agar plate, a little piece of a tremella. And of course, the basidiospores are being shot on the agar surface. And then after a while, you see, maybe 2-3 days, you see small yeast colonies, and you pick them up. And then, of course, with DNA, you can confirm, because of course you have a lot of contamination. There's a very high risk of contaminants growing. That also might be new species, by the way, but you see, you have to always be very careful.
Yes, and now I'm thinking that all the time when I make isolation for Trametes, for Pycnoporus, for many other lentinus, I always see at this yeast colony and say, okay, this is contamination. But maybe it's a new species of yeast, and yeasts are so diverse, no?
Absolutely.
And so diverse.
So another example,
everywhere.
Another example of the ecology of yeast related to mushrooms is via beetles. So you have a lot of beetles that live on mushrooms, bracket fungi, for instance. And these beetles turned out to be a very good source for new yeast species. So Meredith Blackwell in Louisiana, she studied yeast from beetles in the past, and she discovered hundreds of new species. And I'm sure in your country, you can find hundreds, maybe thousands of new species of yeast.
Of course.
Really.
Yes, and there are so few people in Colombia who's working with yeast, but more focused. One group is more focused by industrial application of the yeast, but we have a very big group about the medical mycology, and you see that you have a lot of contribution to the medical mycology with the the study of Cryptococcus, Malassezia, and all these kind of bad guys.
Yeah.
How it works?
But I do think that it is also very important to sample in nature, because then you get to know where even these pathogens are really occurring. Because when you go to an hospital, it's just a patient. But when you go to sample in nature and you find Candida albicans, Cryptococcus neoformans, or whatever, just to give you an example, we did work in the sea waters around Qatar, and we found species from Candida parapsilosis complex. And with Tony Gabaldon in Barcelona, he is using comparative genomics. He postulated a new species, and we found it there from an ecology survey.
We have a lot of estimation about our diversity, and most of them is our diversity in macrofungi, because we see that, but the people forget the micro world. No, we forget that when we collect mushrooms or fungi in the forest, in our forest. But we have this colloquium is focused about the climate change, and we saw that some of these yeasts could be a threatening for us. No, some people say Candida auris could be a very dangerous organism. What do you think about this? Do you think it's true, or is more?
Yeah, I think you always have to be aware of emerging pathogens, and usually they are also occurring in the environment. So I think it's very important also to understand your ecology. Also for Candida auris, I'm convinced that it is occurring in nature. So people found it in some beaches, in islands in the Indian Ocean. The question is always difficult to answer whether that is the real habitat. But I think it's important to know the habitat to also to understand transmission, for instance, and also the emergence of resistance is important, because we find that many so-called non-pathogenic yeasts that are also emerging and getting more important clinically are already resistant to many antifungal drugs, even when they come from nature. So I think it's very important, and there is one theory that the use of antifungals in agriculture might cause resistant isolates. This is true for Aspergillus, for instance, but maybe also for yeasts.
Okay, and well, I was reading about your many papers of you. One paper was very interesting for me, was a publication about the potential application of the yeast the marine fungi to the microplastic problem.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think this is real? Do you think we have a hope, or is only?
I think so. By the way, this was not my work. This was done by a researcher from the Dutch Institute for Marine Research here in the Netherlands, and I collaborated with them. I think it's very interesting. It's really an emerging field, and I think I can understand that fungi can break down these recalcitrant plastics. They can also break down wood. They can break down many complex molecules. Their enzyme arsenal is so interesting for applications. And I think that's another aspect from your work, or from the work for people in Colombia, because you have a lot of various diverse habitats with a huge diversity, and this will open tremendous possibilities for applications. That I'm convinced, and I think it's also important to preserve these fungi in a proper way, like in a kind of culture collection. How you organize it, I don't know, but I think it's important that when students go to the field, or yourself, that your isolates are kept forever in principle and can be reused for other investigations.
And finally, many students are watching this interview for the future, for motivate this to study mycology. But my question is macro or micro? What do you say to them?
For me, that is very easy to answer. I would say do both and follow your own interest. And even when you study microfungi, also consider to make cultures, because even those are very important for maybe the pharmacy, maybe for specific compounds. And as I said, tremella mushrooms and yeast, they belong together. So it depends on your question, of course. But I think follow your own interest.
Teun, thank you so much for accept to give to us this interview. I so learn a lot about yeast. We now are going to put more attention to the tremella and to trametes of all these yeast I found, and sometimes I don't know what doing with this. Teun, thank you so much.
De nada.